What if the light of hope from America never landed on the bloody battlefields of Europe in World War I? A haunting historical question. In 1917, the United States entry, with immense resources and fresh troops, changed the tide, helping the Allies secure a decisive victory. But if the United States maintained its isolationist policy and did not join the war, how would world history have diverged? Let's explore this dramatic scenario. World War I, starting in 1914, plunged Europe into an unprecedented conflict, devastating all aspects of life. By 1917, both the Central Powers and the Allied forces were completely exhausted, with irreparable heavy losses. Millions had died, economies across the continent were paralyzed, and troop morale had severely declined. The war seemed endless. In particular, the Allied powers faced the risk of collapse. Russia withdrew from the war after the tumultuous October Revolution. France was almost depleted of manpower and resources, struggling to maintain its lines against relentless German attacks. Britain also suffered heavy losses, especially from Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening essential supply chains. It was in this desperate context that the United States' entry into the war in April 1917 brought a new source of strength. With immense economic resources and millions of fresh soldiers, America became the decisive factor, tipping the balance towards the Allies. America's involvement led to the collapse of the Central Powers by late 1918, completely changing the course of the war. Now, let us ask, without American intervention, what would have happened? The Allied powers might have collapsed. Germany's spring offensive of 1918, unchecked by the U.S., would have been far more successful, leading to a Central Powers victory. Meanwhile, the United States would strengthen its isolationism, focusing on domestic development, lacking a global leadership role. A new world order would be shaped by the victorious powers, primarily Germany, instead of a Western-led order. When the guns fell silent on the battlefield, it would not be the Allies' cheers, but the triumphant trumpets of the German army. In the summer of 1918, with no American soldiers landing in France, Germany's Ludendorff offensives completely changed the situation. Allied lines were breached irresistibly, leading to a chaotic and desperate retreat. Paris stood on the verge of collapse, its citizens in panic, as German troops advanced close to the French capital. French resistance completely disintegrated, no longer able to sustain the war, forcing them to surrender. A bitter armistice would have been signed, perhaps in Berlin or Versailles, but entirely dictated by Germany. This treaty would have had devastating and unjust terms, completely contrary to the history we know. France would permanently lose Alsace-Lorraine, along with northern territories, which would be annexed into the German Empire. France would become a satellite state, heavily dependent on German economic and military power. Britain, isolated and exhausted, unable to continue fighting alone, would be forced to accept Germany's demands. Britain would be compelled to relinquish its naval supremacy, ceding control of vital shipping lanes to Germany. British African colonies, as part of the deal, might be ceded to the expanding German Empire. Britain would also be forced to sign unfavorable trade treaties, cementing German economic dominance. The German Empire, with undeniable authority, would establish a vast Middle Europa, a new order. This region would include newly formed Eastern European nations after the collapse of the Russian and Dan, Austro-Hungarian empires. However, these nations would all be under tight economic and military control from Berlin. The Balkan kingdoms would be manipulated by Germany, becoming part of Berlin's sphere of influence. Even Turkey, though a weaker ally, would be deeply affected by this new power. A gloomy, disappointed atmosphere would shroud London and Paris, where people lived in shame. No more resounding laughter or the pride of victory, only regret for a lost opportunity. Later generations would grow up in a completely different Europe, under the shadow of Berlin. There would be no American century, as we know it, an era of global leadership and influence. Instead, a new German century would have begun, with Berlin as the world's center of power. The power of the German Empire would spread from economy to military, from culture to politics. The map of Europe and the world would be rewritten, with new borders and power blocks. A balance of power would have changed permanently, creating an unpredictable future. History would have taken a different path, its consequences echoing for decades to come. A world none of us would recognize, shaped by America's decision to remain isolated. The world in 2024 would be entirely different, an unimaginable picture. The German Empire, after its great victory in 1918, would have become a superpower dominating the Eurasian continent. The German economy would boom, unrestricted by the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, it would be strengthened by new lands, resources, and markets from dependent nations. Militarism would still be strong, but not the genocidal fascism history witnessed. Instead, it would be a stable German imperialism, run by a conservative government. This government would focus on maintaining order and expanding economic influence globally. Without the Treaty of Versailles, there would be no humiliation of Germany after its war defeat, and thus no rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party as we know it. A Second World War might not happen, or if it did, it would take a different form. The Soviet Union, isolated and facing a powerful German empire to its west, would have a different fate. It might collapse earlier or develop into a more extreme and closed regime. Instead of expanding global influence, the Soviet Union would focus on self-defense and survival. The United States, with its strengthened isolationist policy, would become a distinct economic superpower. America would be separate from the issues of the old world, focusing entirely on domestic prosperity. American cultures and technologies would still thrive, leading many global trends. However, their political and military influence would be limited to the Americas, not extending globally. No NATO, no United Nations in its current structure. The international order would be different. Instead, order would be shaped by a series of regional power blocs, competing with each other. Perhaps a German-European bloc, dominating the old continent and neighboring regions. A bloc led by Britain Commonwealth, if it still existed after defeat. And an Asian bloc led by Japan or another major power, forming a tripler situation. Technology, especially weapons and aviation, might develop in different directions. Not driven by a second global war, inventions might have other purposes. A world with German dominance could lead to a prolonged Pax Germanica era, a period of stability, but with a strong authoritarian character, where Berlin decides everything. Smaller nations would always have to comply with Berlin's will, without true self-determination. National liberation movements in colonies might be suppressed more strongly by empires, or encouraged by Germany to weaken old imperial rivals like Britain and France, creating a complex and volatile world political map in unpredictable ways. The prospect of a world without American involvement in World War I is truly a haunting and complex picture. It raises questions about the role of nations in history, about the difference between economic power and global political influence. We hope this story has offered new perspectives. What do you think? Please share your thoughts and hypotheses with us.